Very often in life, we believe and perceive things in a very limited way with a limited capacity. We don't see the broad picture because we don't see the future. God brings a famine upon Egypt, which ultimately causes Yaakov to send his children to Egypt to purchase grain, because they would have starved otherwise. And the story of Yosef and his brothers, Yosef being the viceroy, his brothers not recognizing him, and he deals with them in a very harsh, dictatorial manner, and he accuses them of being spies. He takes a brother hostage, Shimon, to prove that the story, that they are members of one family, is true. And to prove that it is a true story, they must bring the youngest brother, Binyamin, the only remnant of the family of Rachel, to Egypt. And they do. Then Yosef contrives an accusation that Binyamin had stolen his goblet, that he had divined with this goblet, which was obvious that it was a contrived accusation and it was a setup. Yehuda enters into a plea with the viceroy, not knowing that this is his brother Yosef. And it reaches a point which Yosef realizes that if he doesn't reveal who he really is, Yehuda would kill him. And at the last moment, before Yehuda had reached the level of not being able to contain himself, because he had said, if I don't return my brother to my father will die. And to Yehuda, that meant, even if he has to destroy Egypt, nothing will interfere with bringing Benjamin back to his father. At that moment, Yosef reveals himself to his brothers and says, Ani Yosef, I am Yosef. Hod Avichai, is my father still alive? And then he tells them, I'm Yosef, your brother who you sold to Egypt. And then they believed him. He showed them, to prove the point, that he was circumcised. And they believed him. And he says, immediately, you must go inform my father that I'm alive. Yaakov immediately comes to Egypt. During the famine, why did God cause a plenty initially in Egypt and then the famine? And the famine affected all the surrounding lands, that they all had to come purchase grain from the Egyptians. What was the value of this? Because it was important that the Egyptian people and the Egyptian government should have an untold level of wealth. But why is it important? The Egyptians believed it was their good fortune. But little did they understand, they were only the custodians of the wealth of the world, because after 210 years, the Jews, when they leave Egypt, they're leaving Egypt with the personal effects of the Egyptians, because that was the promise to Avram Avinu. They will go out with great wealth. When the Egyptians realized that the Jews were not returning, Paro, the Egyptian king, summons his cavalry, his armies, to pursue the Jews. The chariots, the horses, were bedecked with gold and diamonds. And they pursued the Jews right into the sea after it split. The sea closed upon them. Ultimately, after the Egyptian armies were destroyed, the Jews were concerned that maybe the Egyptians were not caught in the sea, and they were worried. So God caused that the remains of the Egyptians and the chariots and the horses should be cast upon the shore. When the Jews saw the horses and the chariots bedecked with the diamonds and the gold, they couldn't contain themselves. The level of wealth that they had seen, there was nothing comparable to this. And they began accumulating. This is besides the wealth that they had taken out of Egypt, which I mentioned before, the Midrash, that the least amount was 10 pack animals, donkeys laden with the gold and silver. The spoils of the sea were much greater than the spoils of Egypt. What was the value of the spoils of the sea? Ultimately, the Jewish people would have to build a Mishkan, a sanctuary for God's presence. The amount of wealth that would be needed was enormous. God did not want that there should be any hesitation or any holdback when the materials would be delineated and mentioned that is necessary for the building of the Mishkan. This is why God had the horses cast upon the shore so the Jews should be able to accumulate this enormous amount of wealth. And it wasn't considered an infringement or an impingement on their financial status. So the Egyptians initially believed they have such fortune, exceptional fortune. Never in the history of the world has all the wealth of the world come to one location. But little did they realize they were only custodians for the Jewish people, that after they leave Egypt, they will be the beneficiaries and the recipients of the wealth of the Egyptian people themselves, and ultimately of the government coffers when the horses and the chariots would be cast upon the seashore.